Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good morning. This morning, I'd like to discuss the meaning of Sukkot. What does Sukkot celebrate? How did sleeping in a hut become a major Jewish holiday? Sukkot doesn't seem to commemorate an important historical event unlike other Jewish holidays. Compared to Passover and Shavuot, the celebration of Sukkot seems to be missing a big event to commemorate. We all know the Sukkot story, how the Israelites slept in the desert in small huts or booths after fleeing from Egypt. But we also see that Sukkot refers to the place where they first slept. Why call a place Sukkot? It's basically the Hebrew equivalent of calling it a shantytown. But could this be a clue into the importance of celebrating Sukkot? The Torah tells us that one more detail about Sukkot, the food, the unleavened dough that we ate on that first night in these makeshift booths. But we also connect that matzah with Pesach, which commemorates the very same event. So how is the meaning of Sukkot different? There seems to be a missing reason of why we celebrate Sukkot. Sukkot is here, and we all know how we celebrate it. Mainly, we build these little huts, and we live in them for 7 days. But why do we actually do that? What are we actually commemorating on this day? Well, here's where we get into a little bit of a quandary. To see that quandary, I'd like to play a little game with you, and it's called Big Deal, Little Deal. And here's the way the game's going to work. We're going to take 3 of the main festivals of the Torah, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and we're going to ask ourselves, what event does this holiday commemorate? And what is the event a big deal, or is it a little deal? So are you ready? Let's start our game. We'll start with Pesach, or Passover. What event does Pesach commemorate? Well, that's easy enough. It celebrates our exodus from slavery, the night that we left Egypt. Okay, so would you call that a big deal, or would you call that a little deal? I don't know about you, but I would say that that's like the biggest of big deals, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, Pesach is pretty much a 10. There are plagues, blood, darkness, hail, fire. The sea splits in this climatic moment of triumph. Death to the bad guys, salvation to the good guys. It's a very big deal. Plus, it's our Independence Day. It's the very beginning of our nation. Okay, so what about Shavuot? How big of a deal is the event commemorated by Shavuot? I'd say on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like an 11. Shavuot celebrates the moment an entire nation assembled with God. Hashem literally descended into our world on top of the mountain to give us a document that would define our destiny, that would shape the course of world civilization. And without that event, what would we be? We would be no more than a nomadic tribe in the wilderness. We would be missing a mission. We would be missing a legacy. And that is a really big deal. All right, so now let's go to Sukkot. What does this holiday commemorate? Well, we sleep in booths, and we do that, the Torah tells us, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Okay, so we sleep in booths because, well, we slept in booths in the desert. So now let's play big deal, little deal. On a scale of 1 to 10, everyone, how big of a deal is this dwelling in booths thing? I'm going to say it's probably like a 2, maybe a 2.5. I mean, it's all very nice and well to sleep in booths, nothing against it certainly, but do we really have to have a whole holiday commemorating it? So you're probably shaking your head right now and you're thinking, okay, come on, sukkahs aren't just these little huts. I seem to remember that the Talmud says something about miraculous clouds that protected the Israelites in the desert. And yes, in fact, that is true. The Talmud records a dispute as to what the holiday of Sukkot actually celebrates. One view is that it celebrates the booths that we slept in. But another Talmudic view is that the holiday commemorates what is called the Anani HaKavod, the clouds of glory, that enveloped the people and protected them in the desert. Suppose we accept the second view, that the holiday commemorates these miraculous clouds. Well, we certainly did need those clouds to survive. I mean, without divine protection of some sort, like those clouds, we would have perished in that uninhabited wilderness. We would have been killed by enemies or by wild animals. So, isn't that worth celebrating? Well, to tell you the truth, you're right. But digging into that Talmudic example opens up some other problems. For example, does the Talmud really mean to tell us that we don't even know what we are celebrating on Sukkot? That it is even a subject of dispute? I mean, think of Passover. We know what we are celebrating on Passover. It's not like there are two separate views in the Talmud debating it. No one says that Passover was really about celebrating God and flying the Israelites out of Egypt on magic carpets. The fact of the Exodus is not in dispute. So how could something as basic as what we are celebrating on Sukkot be open to dispute? And I'd like to suggest a theory here. Maybe there is a big deal in Sukkot, and it can be found if we look for that missing event. And here's what I mean by that. If you look at all the other holidays, you'll find that generally they commemorate a specific event, a point in time that you can actually point to. Pesach commemorates the night that we went free. That is a specific event. Shavuot commemorates the moment that is a specific event. But Sukkot, at face value, seems to break that pattern. It appears to commemorate 40 years worth of sleeping in booths. Day in and day out, booths one night, booths the next. So, is it really the case that we have a holiday that doesn't commemorate an actual event, one that you could point to, just one single event? Maybe not. Maybe there's a discrete event with Sukkot as well. And if we can find it, we can see what the big deal about Sukkot really is. So, let's look at that verse in the Torah and see what it tells us. When we celebrate Sukkot, the Torah says that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Now, let's listen carefully to those words. When I brought them out of the land of Egypt. What exactly is the Torah saying here? It sounds like the Torah is talking about a particular point in time, right? God made us sleep in booths when he brought us out of Egypt, not 40 years in the desert. Seemingly, if we take the words of this verse seriously, it is right when he brought us out that we slept in those booths. But that may sound a little crazy. Is this whole booth commemoration thing really all going back to the very moment of the Exodus, that very first night in the desert? To find out, let's go back to the Torah's own description of those first moments after leaving Egypt, back in the book of Exodus. Is there anything that involved Sukkot in some way? Let's listen to the verse. It describes the very beginning of the Israelites' departure from Egypt. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. I'll read that verse again. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. Where did they travel when they first were leaving Ramses? They traveled to a place called Sukkot. Now, isn't that quite a coincidence? Sukkot just happens to be the name of the very first place that Israel encamped on the very first night after leaving Egypt. And you must ask yourself, is that a coincidence? We have a Sukkot holiday that supposedly celebrates God causing us to dwell in Sukkot when he took us out of Egypt. And lo and behold, right when God took us out of Egypt, the Torah mentions that we slept in a place called Sukkot. Could it be that the holiday commemorates where we slept that first night in the desert? In other words, to be perfectly frank with you, what I'm suggesting here is something that seems kind of radical, but stay with me. When the Torah says that the holiday commemorates God having made us dwell in Sukkot, the verse may not be referring to what we slept in, but maybe it's referring to the place that we slept at, a place called Sukkot. But wait a second, you might say. What are you trying to tell me? That all those rabbis, the ones in the Talmud who talked about Sukkot celebrating sleeping in booths, the ones who talked about the clouds of glory, you're trying to tell me that they were all wrong, that they all missed this obvious implication in the verses? In any way, let's just say that I'm right, and that having made us dwell in Sukkot means that God settled us in a place called Sukkot. Why would we celebrate that? Who cares where we slept that first night when we left Egypt? I mean, look, every place has to have a name, right? This place happened to be called Sukkot. Wonderful. Let's eat. So here would be my response to that. The theory I'm suggesting to you, it doesn't oppose what the rabbis in the Talmud said. On the contrary, I would argue it is the basis for what they said, and it's their point of departure. In other words, the rabbis of the Talmud, they too understood that the holiday celebrates our sleeping in a place called Sukkot. The rabbis were just making the following obvious inference. What do you think, or why do you think that place was called that? Why, of all things, would you call a place Sukkot? Again, basically, it's calling it the Hebrew equivalent of a shanty town. And it's probably because people made these little shanties, these little Sukkot huts, so they could sleep there. And here's the proof of it. It turns out that here in Exodus is not the first time that the Torah mentions a place called Sukkot. Way back in Genesis, we also encounter a place that's named that. When Jacob left Laban's house, exiting his own personal slavery in his father-in-law's domain, one of the first places he came to was a place called Sukkot. And the Torah tells us why it was called that. Jacob built little huts there for his cattle, huts that he called Sukkot. And the Torah tells us that's why he called the name of the place Sukkot. So basically, in Exodus, the Torah just kind of uses shorthand to get its point across, based on what it assumes that we already know from the book of Genesis. In other words, the verse says, the Israelites, like Jacob before them, also exited slavery, and like Jacob, they also had lots of cattle. And then the very next thing we hear about is, like Jacob before them, the people slept in a place called Sukkot. Well, how did the place get its name? Well, that's left implied. Obviously, it was because they built Sukkot there, little huts for their cattle, just like Jacob did in similar circumstances. The difference between Jacob and the people, if anything, is that while Jacob had built a house for himself and huts for the cattle, when it came to the people living in Egypt, there weren't separate domiciles for the people and the cattle. Rather, it was in Sukkot where the shanties made for the cattle were where the people slept as well. Sukkot here is the place, but it is because of the shanties. That night, everyone, cows, sheep, people, everyone slept in those shanties. And according to Leviticus, that is what we are celebrating. God says, I made you sleep in Sukkot that first night. That is where I settled you. Okay, but now let's go back to that second objection that I raised for you. Let's say we accept that the Torah is asking us to celebrate a single night's encampment in the desert in little huts. So why is that such a really big deal? Why would we be celebrating for generations what happened that very first night? Is that really the big missing event? The answer is that night in those huts, it was a momentous turning point for our nation. Come with me for a moment back into the Torah's description of that very first night, and you'll find a curious thing. Right after we hear about the first night in a place called Sukkot, the Torah tells us something else that seems fairly trivial. It takes a step back to give us what looks like an accounting of the total years that we spent in slavery. Now, the time that the children of Israel dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. Now, why would the Torah do that? Why would it bother to tell us right now, as it is recounting the night after we left as a nation and we spent it in Sukkot? Why is the Torah suddenly interested in playing accountant with us, in making sure that we all know exactly how many years that we spent in Egypt? The answer, I think, will jump out at you if you pay attention to another phrase in that verse that I just read to you. Now, don't get distracted by the 430 years thing. Instead, look at the verse's first words. And the settling down that the children of Israel settled down while they were in Egypt were 430 years. The Torah is establishing a very interesting contrast for you, the reader. For 430 years, the people had been settled down. They had a real roof over their head. They might have been guests in Egypt. They might have been slaves, but they knew that when they went home at night, they had a reliable shelter and a real home in which they would sleep. They knew where their next meal was coming from, and in an instant, all of that changed. It changed that very first night of freedom when they found themselves sleeping in those little cattle pens alongside the sheep and the cows. It changed when, after 430 years of being settled in Egypt, they were now settled by God in those little cattle pens in the desert. It all changed that night in Sukkot. So stop and think for a minute. What was that first night? What must it have been like? Here they were, their first night away from Egypt. It was the first night that they experienced without a master's lash at their backs. That night, they breathed in the stimulating air of freedom. For the first time in generations, they could come and go as they pleased. They could make choices. And on one hand, it was like living a dream. But that dream was also full of terror. They were in the desert, and they had nowhere real to sleep, no home to call their own. They were sleeping with the cattle, for goodness sake, right next to Betsy the cow and Fluffy the sheep. You could almost imagine what might have been going through their minds. This is ridiculous. What am I even doing here? What have I done by leaving Egypt? To add to that ridiculousness of the situation, the Torah tells us one more thing about that night. It tells us what they ate that night while they were sleeping in Sukkot. Let's read a little bit farther into that verse. And they baked the dough that they had brought forth out of Egypt, unleavened bread, because it didn't have time to rise. Because they were cast out of Egypt, they didn't have time to tarry. They didn't have time to take provisions for their journey. So it was some night that night, under the stars, without even decent bread to eat. But you read those verses and you say to yourself, wait a minute, they had matzah that first night? You're thinking to yourself, matzah, isn't that a Sukkot, or that's not a Sukkot activity, that's a Pesach activity. On Pesach, we eat unleavened bread to remember how we rushed out of Egypt. What are we doing here? If I just pieced together all the clues for you about that first night in Sukkot, only to arrive at a different holiday, something really interesting is beginning to emerge here, it seems to me. That there are two holidays in the Torah, Pesach and Sukkot, that somehow both seem to be commemorating the same exact event. That very first night that Israel spent alone in the desert. The only difference between the holidays seems to be one of perspective. On one holiday, Pesach, it commemorates the first night from the perspective of food. We remember what we ate that night. The other holiday, Sukkot, commemorates the night in terms of where we slept. The two basic needs in life, of course, are food and shelter. And we had both of them in abundance in Egypt. Bread for eating and a real roof over our head. We had those necessities, but we were missing freedom. And it seemed free, the bread and the roof, but there was a price. We were slaves. And suddenly, in an instant, everything changed. God caused 10 plagues to descend upon our tormentors, and suddenly our masters were powerless to keep us tethered to them anymore. We could go now. The question is, would we go? We made a choice the moment we left Egypt. A crazy choice, if you stop to think about it. We made a choice to embrace freedom, to accept God's invitation to become his holy nation, and to travel to the land that he promised us, a land that we had never seen, and all without any real preparation. There was no logistical infrastructure for this journey. Imagine tasking a modern-day Army Corps of Engineers with the duty to lay infrastructure for a walk through the desert that would last 40 years and would include 2.3 million people taking that journey. That project would cost billions of dollars. You'd have to set up roads, plumbing, groceries, stores for clothing, and you have to throw in a few good 7-Elevens for measure. But none of that would be in place for the Israelites' journey. It was a choice that was thrust on them in an instant. This is your chance. Are you ready to go? The choice to leave can't be described as anything other than a supreme act of faith. We quite literally placed ourselves in the embrace of the divine and said, in effect, you're inviting us, Lord, and we are going. Our most basic needs, they are all now in your hands. The text tells us the journey to Sukkot, it emphasizes the tentative nature, the journey, and it was telling us that they hadn't even packed any provisions, that they were there that first night, sleeping under the stars in ridiculous cattle pens that they had set up for their animals. They were there eating their last morsel of half-baked bread, realizing with stunning clarity that there was no more where that came from. There they were, for the first time, utterly and totally dependent on God. That was the night that these two holidays, Pesach and Sukkot, are celebrating. It's more than just sleeping in huts. So we asked earlier what the big deal was about Sukkot. Making Sukkot doesn't seem to be an earth-shattering event as the Exodus. But I think the answer is it was earth-shattering what happened that first night in a quiet, terrifying kind of way. The act of faith is always earth-shattering. The pit of your stomach as you look around in the desert and you feel alone, only having it dawn on you that you really are not alone. There's someone else there, another presence, and that other presence is Hashem. It's just you and Hashem now. And you have just left behind everything that you took for granted and made this harrowing choice to completely rely on God. If God doesn't come through for you here, the next night could very well be your last. The prophet Jeremiah says something to us about God's memories of that first night. And here is the language. Go and call out to Jerusalem, saying, Thus says God, I remember the gifts of kindness of your youth, the love of your bridal days, when you followed me out into the wilderness, in a land that was desolate, that couldn't grow anything. So that night, that was a big deal for us. And it was also a big deal for God. It was the night that we gave God the gift of our trust. I mentioned to you before that there was a dispute among the sages as to what we celebrate on Sukkot. Are we commemorating the booths that we slept in? Or are we commemorating the divine clouds of glory? I wonder if there might be something complementary about those two views. In other words, if you go back to that very first night in the desert, we slept in those booths. And there were really two important things that happened simultaneously. The first thing that happened was that we slept in those little booths. That's what we did, the people of Israel. But we weren't the only ones who did something that night. God did something too. We put ourselves vulnerable in God's hand, ceding our most basic need for protection to him. And God saw us leap into the darkness, as it were, and he responded to our act of faith with an act of his own. He provided for us in the desert. He sheltered us. He said, I see your shanty towns, and I'll raise you one. I'll establish for you clouds of glory. I will turn your token efforts at providing shelter for yourselves, efforts that you know are not adequate. I will turn those efforts into a miraculous sustenance and protection. I will envelop you in divine clouds, as it were. God understood our need for protection, and he responded in kind. We woke up the next morning safe and sound, and the next morning, and the morning after that, day in and day out, for 40 years, we were under God's protection. As for the dispute as to what we commemorate on Sukkot, now I think we understand that the dispute isn't about what happened. Did we sleep in booths, or did God protect us with divine clouds? Both of those things happened. The dispute is about what we are commemorating on this holiday. The Talmudic view suggests that we are commemorating the booths, the Sukkot. It's suggesting that we are commemorating our act, the human act of faith, the leap into darkness that was the first night's stay in Sukkot. That was an act of faith. And if you think about it, it was also an act of love. The greatest gift we give another in love is a willingness to trust them, to cede control to them, and to put ourselves completely in their hands. And that was what we did on that first night. And the other Talmudic view, it suggests that we are commemorating God's reciprocating act with a protective act of love of his own. One view suggests that we are commemorating Israel's heroism when we celebrate Sukkot. The other view suggests that we are commemorating God's heroism, his willingness to be our knight in shining shining armor, as it were, is a way that we celebrate Sukkot. One last little wrinkle, it seems to me, remains to be dealt with. If this theory is to be accepted, this theory that on some level Pesach and Sukkot both celebrate the very same night, but from different perspectives, celebrate it months later on another date entirely. Why choose a date that seems to bear no obvious connection to the Exodus at all? The date of Sukkot. Well, here's a clue for starters. The date on which we celebrate Sukkot is not just any old random date. It's the 15th of Tishrei, It is in an intriguing way related to Pesach. It occurs exactly 6 months after the onset of unleavened bread. It is actually a date that is the exact opposite end of the calendar, the farthest that you can get from the middle of Nisan. It seems like the Torah was specifically situating Sukkot at the furthest calendrical point from Pesach that it possibly could. And maybe that's because that's when Sukkot is needed the most. Because Sukkot is not just about the furthest point on the calendar from that first night, but it's the furthest point from experience as well. The farthest we as a nation get from that first night in a temporary shelter when we were nothing but a ragtag band of escaped slaves huddled around campfires in no man's land. The farthest point we could get from that is when we were a sovereign nation in our own land, living in sturdy homes with the security of a successful harvest behind us. It is at that moment when our home is a fortress that we snuggle up under the covers and know exactly where our next meal is coming from. That's the night that we are supposed to begin to celebrate at Sukkot. The 15th of Tishri, the Torah tells us, is a time of ingathering of grain. The harvest is finally over. At this time of the year, we are most susceptible to the belief that we are self-sufficient, that we have brought into our homes the sturdy structures, the food that will secure our future. Until now, perhaps we were vulnerable. When we planted the grain back in the spring, the seedlings may not take. There may not be rain. But now at Sukkot time, when we gather the grain into our homes, at this time of year, our homes have become true fortresses of agricultural security. Now we are finally safe and secure. It's then that we are asked to leave our home behind and to reoccupy the huts that we slept in that first night. And in doing so, we recreate the precious gift of that first night, the gift of trust. Back then, we placed ourselves, fragile and vulnerable, in the care of our Creator. And so we do that now. Now, even when we have a roof over our heads, even when we've got indoor plumbing and the gift of electricity, when we have sofas and comfy beds and Keurig machines, now we place ourselves under the Creator's protection just as we did back then. So when we do so, we begin to understand that on some level, a home is a little more than a hut. The security that it provides us is deceptive. We do it because it is only one little pig who believes that if he makes his home not out of straw, not out of wood, but out of bricks, then the big bad wolf can't huff and puff and blow his house down. But we know that that is not true. All houses can be blown down if the hurricane is terrifying enough and if the enemy is threatening enough. Real security comes from Hashem. Sukkot, all told, was a gift of love, a gift of faith that we as a people gave to our Creator, a gift of care that reciprocated to us in turn. It is these gifts that we are asked to remember, to recreate year after year, every Sukkot, so that we will never forget the embrace of our heavenly protector. So I say, may your Sukkah be blessed with love. And as the praise and worship team begins to come forward, we will begin to celebrate our Parade of Nations. And I have just a little bit to say about the Parade of Nations. The Parade of Nations during a Sukkot service is a symbolic event that highlights the universal significance of the holiday in our tradition. And here are the main reasons for performing the Parade of Nations during a Sukkot service. In ancient times, during Sukkot, 70 offerings were made at the temple in Jerusalem, which were understood to represent the 70 nations of the world. This further emphasizes that Sukkot involves not only Israel, but all people. The parade symbolizes the hope for the well-being of all nations and the recognition that humanity is interconnected. The Parade of Nations during Sukkot celebrates the idea of variety within humanity, while also highlighting the underlying unity of all nations under God. In our service today, this parade involves members of different ethnic and national backgrounds, carrying flags to represent their countries, symbolizing the global aspirations for peace, harmony, and recognition of the divine. In Messianic Jewish belief, the Parade of Nations during Sukkot carries a profound symbolic meaning related to the future Messianic era and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And here is how it is understood. The fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah. The primary Messianic connection comes from the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 14, which foretells that after the arrival of the Messiah, all nations will ascend to Jerusalem to celebrate Sukkot. This signifies a time when the whole world will recognize God's sovereignty and peace will prevail under Messianic rule. The Parade of Nations during Sukkot reflects this prophecy and symbolizes the event that when all nations will gather under God. It also reflects the hope for an era in which humanity is reconciled to both God and to one another, and describes messianic prophecies. Through the Messiah Yeshua, all people are invited to participate in the blessings of God's kingdom. Sukkot, with its universal themes, is a celebration of this inclusion, where the blessings of the God of Israel is extended to all nations. This Parade of Nations during Sukkot has messianic meaning and is prophetic in its picture of the messianic kingdom, when all nations will recognize God's sovereignty and come to worship him in Jerusalem and be united in peace. It celebrates the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, the unity of Jews and Gentiles, the ingathering of nations, and the hope for a redeemed world under the reign of Messiah.